Hello, my name is Ghinwa Hakim and you are watching the Arabic Hour. Today, we bring you coverage of the Hilda Silverman Memorial with guest Dr. Sara Roy and with keynote speaker Philip Weiss giving the lecture entitled Community and Ideology, What Will It Take for American Jews to Walk Away from Zionism?
The key moment in my development was a far more American moment, was our invasion of Iraq. And I was with my brother in California and ahead of the invasion, and he said to me, what do you think about this Iraq war? I demonstrated against the Vietnam War, but my Jewish newspaper says this war could be good for Israel. And I cannot convey to this day how upsetting that was to me.
The Hilda Silverman Memorial Lecture, held annually to honor the late Hilda Silverman, internationally known peace and human rights activist whose work on Israeli-Palestinian reconciliation was seminal and inspirational, was recently held on April 16, 2013, at the First Church in Cambridge Congregational. The lecture, entitled Community and Ideology, What Will It Take for American Jews to Walk Away from Zionism, was given by Philip Weiss, creator and editor of the popular blog Mondoweiss. The event was sponsored by American Jews for a Just Peace Boston and co-sponsored by the Palestine-Israel Task Team of First Church in Cambridge Congregational. Mondoweiss, created by Philip Weiss, is a news website devoted to covering American foreign policy in the Middle East, chiefly from a progressive Jewish perspective. Philip Weiss, an American journalist, has previously written for the New York Times Magazine, the New York Observer, and many others. He co-edited the Coldstone Report, The Legacy of the Landmark Investigation of the Gaza Conflict in 2011. And now to Cambridge with Lila Bernstein from American Jews for a Just Peace, Boston.
So good evening. Thank you for being here. My name is Lila Bernstein and I'm on the steering committee for AJJP. This event is put on almost every year by American Jews for a Just Peace Boston, known as AJJP, so you'll hear me say AJJP a few times. And this event is co-sponsored by the Palestine-Israel Task Team of First Church in Cambridge, where we sit right now. So we have two wonderful guests tonight, Sara Roy and Phil Weiss, and we have a short film about Hilda Silverman. So before I introduce Sara, I want to acknowledge that I never met or knew Hilda. That said, she influenced so many people in this room who have in turn influenced me, including through my involvement with AJJP, but also collectives that we have across this area. So I consider AJJP my political home, and I'm very grateful to Hilda for influencing people who are part of this movement in this area. Sara Roy earned a doctorate in education from Harvard University and is a senior research scholar at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, specializing in the Palestinian economy, Palestinian Islamism, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Dr. Roy is also co-chair of the Middle East Seminar, jointly sponsored by the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs and the Center for Middle Eastern Studies. Dr. Roy began her research in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank in 1985 with a focus on the economic, social, and political development of the Gaza Strip and on U.S. foreign assistance to the region. Since then, she has written extensively on the Palestinian economy, particularly in Gaza, and on Gaza's de-development, a concept she originated. In addition to her academic work, she serves on the Advisory Council of American Near East Refugee Aid, ANERA, and has served as a consultant to international organizations, the U.S. government, human rights organizations, private voluntary organizations, and private business groups working in the Middle East. Sara is the daughter of Holocaust survivors. So with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Sara Roy.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm very pleased, very honored to be here. Hilda was a close and dear friend of mine for over 20 years. and I miss her greatly. Next month will be the 5th anniversary of Hilda's death. It hardly seems possible that 5 years have already passed since this truly remarkable human being left us, because she remains so present in our personal and professional lives. She remains so deep and powerful among us because of her moral clarity and intellectual force, and because of her humanity and decency, which do not diminish with time, but in fact grow stronger. I cling to Hilda's memory as I mourn yesterday's horrific events in Boston. I met Hilda in 1986, and with our first meeting, I recognized how profound and extraordinary a person, a human being she was. I learned a great deal from her about many things, and her good word meant more than I can possibly express. One way to understand Hilda and what she represented to us and to the world is to begin with some of her writings, which I often like to do when I'm speaking about her. The first piece of writing that I'd like to read from was written in the summer of 2007 in response to the controversy over the recognition of the Armenian genocide. She wrote, quote, "What we are talking about here is the notion of an expendable people. Most of us who identify as Jews have a deep and visceral understanding that at many times and in many parts of the world, and today still in some parts of the world, we have been considered expendable. I think the extraordinary passion and rage of the Armenian community in recent weeks has shown that this is a community mobilized to say, in effect, neither we as a people nor our history are expendable. So long as Palestinians, and in some contexts Arabs and Muslims more generally, are still considered expendable, defined as enemy, terrorist, and other by organizations, individuals, and governments with enormous power, none of us is truly safe." End quote. In a poem to Rachel Corrie written on March 18, 2003, just 2 days after Rachel was killed in the Gaza Strip, Hilda wrote, "Whatever words might have been adequate have become a high-fluting cry, like the keening wit-tutu of the unseen bird outside my window. All day I have been trying to break free from the bulldozer's blade, piled earth, steel treads, fracturing skull and chest, that moment of resistance and protest, stilled frame reverberating beyond the moment, like the kid in Tiananmen Square before the tank. Her bright orange jacket and megaphone, her kind and tired eyes. All day I have been pierced by the high note of helplessness, the ragged beat of despair. Shrouded body with its blur of blood, the quiet hands of mourners bearing her, flag sheathed across the town. And why was she there? Ask the ones whose truth she saw and sought to speak. Ask the child sitting atop slanting slabs of concrete, debris of his demolished home. Ask the husband of the pregnant woman trapped beneath crushing rubble, the neighbor's bulldozed house bringing their own walls down, who cradled her toddler as she died. Ask the families, hundreds, huddled in wind-ripped tents, homes wrecked without warning to make way for the separation wall. Ask the ones who aren't American and don't make the morning news. Whatever words we have are useless against this cruel weight. The bird's cry keens from every crack in the edifice of history. Before she died, Rachel Corrie wrote of the privilege granted her, an outsider, but denied to those under occupation. I have a home. I am allowed to go see the ocean. End quote. In a tribute to Hilda after her death, the American Friends Service Committee wrote, quote, one of Hilda's greatest gifts was her understanding of Jewish values and the lessons of the Holocaust, which drove her to work incessantly for justice for all people. In her work on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, this led her to always push to the core of the issue ask the hard questions, and propose the visionary solution while honoring the humanity of everyone involved. End quote. Hilda's life was animated by the need to protect the vulnerable, rejecting safety for herself as long as it was denied others. She was our thinking heart, always, who could never sit quietly at her desk while others grieved and suffered, and their suffering for her, never alien but familiar, willingly embraced as her own, who never chose exemption, not once, but always found beauty, love, and compassion. Thank you.
Both of my grandmothers, particularly, were very, very involved in garnering support for what was first Palestine and then Israel. And one of my grandmothers actually went there for her special birthdays. She hadn't had money as a young person, but as she got older, her children would put their money together to give her special things for her birthdays. And she always wanted the same special thing, which was a trip to Israel. So I heard about the greening of the country from my maternal grandmother, who was extraordinarily progressive on other issues. She used to say that she would have joined the Communist Party as a young person if she'd had the $5. So I grew up, and my parents were implicitly very supportive of Israel too, but it was really my grandmothers who were particularly active. I grew up in a not particularly religious household, but I was very conscious of being Jewish. I was also very conscious from quite a young age of the Shoah, of the Holocaust. We had a friend whose niece survived, but much of the family was killed, and the niece would come and visit sometimes, and I knew not to ask her questions about her experience in the camps, but I knew, I was from quite a young age, I knew about that, and that was a sort of a long-standing, continues to be, interest of mine, and had a really profound impact on my thinking about myself and the Jewish people. I never had any reason as a young person to question Israel at all, including when I was in college. I remember very, very vividly my first year in college. My college roommate was also Jewish, and it was one of the big wars. And she said to me, "We have to remember that Arabs have rights too." And I was so offended, and I was very left on everything else. I was so offended that I stopped talking to her. I just had no place in my brain to put this concept of rights for Arabs. My shorthand version of my own biography is that I was born in the year of Kristallnacht, and I grew up putting quarters in blue boxes. And the quarters in blue boxes were for trees for first Palestine and then Israel. And we did so much to plant these trees, and then to have found in recent years, to have learned that so many of those trees covered over destroyed Palestinian villages. And they weren't even indigenous to the area. I mean, they were because Jews were missing the forests and wherever they came from. And feeling that somehow I had to do something both to honor my grandmothers who did that, who believed they were making the world a better place by doing that work, and by helping to undo it in some way. And so it just had enormous emotional resonance for me. I feel very deeply that people shouldn't have to struggle alone. And so I certainly feel that Palestinians on the ground should not have to. And some of the work I do is directly in support from time to time, particularly of Palestinians on the ground. But increasingly over time, it's more indirect support. It's more that I work with Israelis, primarily Jews, but also Israeli-Palestinians, because many times they work together, who are doing what appears to me to be very courageous and important work in support of Palestinians on the ground. So it's sort of a combination, but I think that the notion that people shouldn't have to struggle alone is a very profound motivator for me. Well, I choose to be with people and connect with people who make me feel good. I mean, I think that's human. And I think we nourish each other. I think that there's a lot of mutual, nourishment of each other. And many, many people, this has been my experience over a long period of time, many particularly U.S. Christians who are knowledgeable and deeply caring about what's happening with Palestinians struggle enormously because of allegations of anti-Semitism. And I am so clear in my mind that it is not anti-Semitic to criticize Israel, and in fact it is profoundly supportive of the very best of what Israel has to offer, of the people who are there in the ground struggling to do that. So I am so deeply sure of myself in that area that I think I actually, without doing it intentionally in any way, I think I am helpful in some ways to people I'm close to or have connection with who are U.S. Christians who are understandably struggling with these issues. And I know that the attacks are very vicious, can be very vicious, and the people who launch the attacks don't care about the feelings or the sensibilities of the people they're attacking, whether they're Jewish or not, by the way. I mean, for Jews, it's just that you're self-hating, obviously, not that you're anti-Semitic. And I'm pretty immune to those attacks, I must say, and I think that somehow that rubs off and is helpful to people. To get beyond denial in terms of the price that was paid by another people for the founding and the flourishing of the state. That feels to me like the most, important political task, political, psychological, emotional task to be done, that needs to be accomplished in the coming years. And so in a way that makes me radical, because just talking about ending the occupation doesn't do it for me anymore. I mean, I was an end the occupation person, but that was a long time ago. And I think that we need to go back to the time of my grandmothers. I mean, to the period when wonderful, caring, giving, loving people, Jewish people, really deeply believed in the myth that this was a land without a people, for a people without a land, and that the greening of that land was an extraordinary miracle. I carry that in me. I don't know that there was ever a people in the history of the world who deserved a place of their own on the planet as much as Jews did in the late 1940s. And so that's a part of who I am. And I believe that the price was too high, and I think it was too high from the very beginning for Palestinians. So I live with so much profound contradiction.
You are watching coverage of the Hilda Silverman Memorial Lecture, and we will be back with the keynote speaker, Philip Weiss, after this short break.
You are watching The Arabic Hour, a program of news, views, culture, cuisine, and the Arab American experience. To view today's program or any previous programs, log on to our website at www.arabichour.org.
I'm now going to introduce our featured speaker for the evening. Phil Weiss was born at the Boston Lying Inn 57 years ago, and he grew up in Baltimore. He has worked as a writer all his life. He's been a contributing writer to the New York Times Magazine, Harper's, Esquire, and Spy magazines, and was a columnist for many years at the New York Observer. In the wake of the Iraq War, Phil began to examine issues of Zionism in Jewish life and in the American power structure. In 2006, he founded a website, Mondoweiss.net, devoted to these questions and, inspired in part by Hilda Silverman, began reporting on the conditions of Palestinian life in the occupied territories. The site also aims to build a diverse community with posts from many authors. Phil has published 2 books, a novel about New York politics and an investigation of a murder in the Peace Corps. He lives in the Hudson Valley with his wife, who's also a writer. He has no children, but has recently become a beekeeper. Phil's talk tonight is called Community and Ideology. What will it take for American Jews to walk away from Zionism? I ask you to join me in welcoming Phil Weiss.
Thank you, Lila. And also thanks to Alice, to Tanya, to Gay, and of course to Karen for organizing this. It's really great to be here. I should say that I think it's appropriate that I'm giving this, I'm honored, but I think it's also appropriate because Hilda played a really important role in my development. I knew her only for a couple of years. I was supposed to see her. The one time we were supposed to meet was the fall of 2007 in September, and she was supposed to pick me up at the train, and she got a biopsy that week, and it put her schedule, it upended her schedule, as you know, and Hilda died the following spring. In the years that I knew her, the couple of years, she played a really important role because, as I'm going to relate in my comments, she was, she gave me permission from a Jewish perspective to look into, as a Jew, to look into this. I think it's a little pathetic now, looking back on my life, and I'll reflect on this, that I required that degree of permission, but it's true. And it was especially important that she was a woman, and a very strong woman. Could be a pain in the ass. She saw that in me too. I think that we got along really well that way. My own parents had disappointed me on this issue, as my community disappointed me on this issue. And I remember saying to her once, you're a mother figure to me. This is important to me. And she said, talk to my kids. Before you make me a mother figure, you might want to hear about the whole. So she had a great sense of humor, and I think that she had a great sense of political imagination too, which is so vital to, not that we can speak of achievements in this community. I think it's really hard to speak of achievements. We have so little to show for this work in terms of the human rights of the people who are affected. But she had great political imagination. And many of you know that this project, it's funny, but this project that she was dedicated to, one of the projects certainly she was dedicated to me, was that she was trying to get Paul Newman to undo Exodus. And she would say that I have bought enough of that goddamn salad dressing that part of that foundation money is mine. And this movie was so important in 1960, 62. I don't know when the Preminger movie came out. He made the damage. I'm going to get him. I should read from the emails. They were just, as Sarah indicated, she was a wonderful writer. Among other things. And so she was trying to get the foundation. She said, I know I'm going to get one shot with him, one shot. And when I get to him, I'm going to try to convince him that this documentary or this ad should begin with him coming out and saying, I am Ari Ben Canaan. He was, as Hilda said, the Jewish Tarzan, who that was part of the Zionist cell, was this Jewish Tarzan that Paul Newman was. And she held him responsible, as she should have, and she wanted that ad to begin with him coming out. And the one thing that I can reflect with some pleasure on is that a few months after Hilda left us, Paul Newman left us, and I just know that when he got up there, he got a piece of her mind. So I noticed that on the program, the going home part follows immediately after my talk. So I'm going to try to not talk too long, leave a lot of time for some discussion, because it seems to me that a lot of people in this room have their own opinions about this matter and have been engaged in this matter for a long time. So I want to give you all an opportunity too. My comments are going to break into two parts. The first is going to be more emotional, and the second part is going to be more analytical. And the first part is going to be kind of the Jewish hand-wringing portion, and the second part is going to be more political and intellectual, I hope. Hilda would say, when she would send me emails, they would come, I remember she saying, "I think," and she would always put 2 asterisks on either side of think and then underline it in boldface, as if to say, you know, it was more than think, it was sense, I feel, so I think that I'll get to that intellectual part. So I'm going to tell a little sort of autobiography about how I came to this issue very late. I'm very unlike Hilda in that I never put a quarter in a blue box. I was not indoctrinated. I grew up in a very Jewish household. My father was an academic. I was very strong sense of cultural Jewish affiliation, but very little organizational, eccentric family, very little organizational connection. So no quarters in the blue box. And happily for me, when J.R. Crevens, my best friend, came up to me in elementary school and said, "They knocked out the Syrian Air Force airplanes on the tarmac, they knocked out the Egyptian airplane," it was in 1967, I had no idea what he was talking about. And I did receive Zionist propaganda at my bar mitzvah the following year, but we didn't even belong to a synagogue. So I was lucky in that respect, but I also I just say that my own background is somewhat eccentric here, and I sensed as a writer and as a journalist who was engaged on what I hope to be important questions through my 30s and 40s, I was getting more serious as a writer. I had a sense that I would someday have to come and grapple with this Israel question, but it never landed in my lap. I'm here with my publisher, Scott Roth, and he, from a very early age, he had family over there. His grandfather was bringing him over there and bringing him out onto the balcony of the hotel and showing him Tel Aviv. Really powerful story of indoctrination that he, at the age of 20, he couldn't go back. He saw what was going on, he couldn't go back. I find it a moving story because he reflects a lot of the Jewish experience about what Israel's become. I didn't have any of that. And so the key moment in my development was a far more American moment, was our invasion of Iraq. And I was with my brother in California and ahead of the invasion, and he said to me, "What do you think about this Iraq war? I demonstrated against the Vietnam War, but my Jewish newspaper says this war could be good for Israel." And I cannot convey to this day how upsetting that was to me. It was just, it was shocking to me on a number of levels. And first of all, to have my own brother say that this war, it didn't take, I mean, you have to have an advanced degree in, getting ahead in the media or the political culture to have believed that this war was a good idea. It was a terrible idea to anyone who had any sort of historical sense, any understanding of it was just I was in the streets, as I'm sure most of you were. And to have my brother say this to me, to invoke our history of resistance to such follies, and then to say my Jewish newspaper and to talk about Israel, it just was really upsetting. And the effect on me was that I realized that I really had to, that was in 2003, this was really whether I'd put a quarter in the blue box or not, this was something of my inheritance as a member of the Jewish community, which I still felt. And the Jewish hand-wringing part, which is the emotional part of these comments, involves the fact that I finally got out there at 50 in 2006, and I've gone many times since to see the occupation, this Jewish achievement, the occupation of Palestinian land. But that it took a lot to give me permission to even look at this issue. And one of the moments that was important, and I review this because I think that I want to take it out from the Jewish community in this conversation, but it began for me in this very, as an American, protesting a war that was bad for America, and then being told in this kind of sotto voce way from inside the Jewish community, this could be good for Israel, which Joe Klein said the neoconservatives said to him in 2003 when they got him to support that war. But he said, people said he called it a benign domino theory that would liberate Jerusalem, or that would liberate the road to Jerusalem led through Baghdad. I reflect that when I was in college here, and I was at the Harvard Crimson, a very important moment happened in my life that touches on these issues. And it was in 1974 or 5. I was very young, very little political understanding. But a friend had said that Israel was expansionist. And I said to in the Harvard Crimson newsroom, I said to Eric Brindell, who was a young neoconservative, led a very prominent career, died at a young age, editor of the New York Post. I said to Eric, but Israel's expansionist. What do you think about that? And he said to me, you really can't say that unless you know about the Balfour Declaration and the history of Transjordan. And he started to relate these facts to me, or these things that I didn't know to me, that I couldn't really have an opinion about this matter unless I knew that. And in retrospect, it was a literacy test that I was being administered. I absorbed it as a literacy test. And it was that I was allowed to have an opinion on South Africa without going there, without knowing the history. I was allowed to have an opinion on Vietnam. But here was Eric, the son of a Holocaust survivor, saying to me, you really can't get engaged in this unless you know all this stuff. And I was intimidated by that, and I stayed away. And I would observe that Eric went out the following year to help sell in 1977, when Menachem Begin, the first Likud prime minister, came in, the former terrorist. Eric came in to help sell him to an American audience. And Rashid Khalidi's book, his new book, Brokers of Deceit, makes very clear that the terms that Menachem Begin established in 1977, at that very time, about what type of Palestinian autonomy they would countenance in the West Bank, those terms were cruel and just brutal, but they were that they shall never, the territory, they will have autonomy inside the territory, but they won't have rights to the territory as such. This is Jewish land, going back to... So Eric, when he gave me this lecture, this short lecture about I couldn't say it's expansionist because I didn't know about the history of Transjordan, which was Jewish land. And I didn't know about the Balfour Declaration, which gave all of Israel, said all of Israel was the homeland of the Jewish people. That was reflected in Begin's statement, and then was accepted as American policy since then. Rashid Khalidi's book is very clear on this, that American presidential advisors heard these terms, understood these terms, and never bucked these terms. And the situation we face today is merely a fulfillment of those terms, and was clear as day back then, was evident to those who were close to the situation back in the day. And people like me abdicated, liberals like me abdicated from an engagement on this matter. And I did so in some large measure out of a sense of community allegiance. And that is, again, what Hilda helped to break me out of. Here I am in my late 40s, in my 50s, needing to talk, obviously an extremely impressive person, but needing to get permission from her. A couple of other moments that after '03, after this comment with exchange with my brother, I understood that this was part of my path as a journalist. It became my path. And in time, I started this website. It was originally a blog, a personal blog. It increasingly became involved with issues of Jewish identity and Zionism. I ultimately lost my job at the New York Observer because my boss was a Zionist, the new owner was a Zionist. I also began to understand that I wasn't alone, even inside the Jewish community. The other moment in this first section of Jewish hand-wringing that I want to continue to explain was in '09, I went to a Seder that a group of American Jews for a Just Peace held outside the consulate in Philadelphia, an all-night Seder outside the Israeli consulate on the night of, it was Der Yassin night, I believe, in '09. And so I was there all night, or most of the night, forgive me, I'm putting on airs. At around midnight, we got someone came to give us a workshop. It was mostly Jews, and we were talking about the Nakba a lot, but this woman came, she was from Milwaukee. I remember she had a newsboy cap with her hair stuffed up in it, she had cowboy boots, she had jeans, she was a real Woody Guthrie-like figure. She was like a traveling workshop coordinator. And she was going to help us Jews wrestle with the feelings around the Nakba. And I remember that she went around, the particular moment that was, she went around the group and she said to each of us, I want you to say, hold your hand down on the ground or up in the air, how much support you got from your families for this work, for the work you're doing. And just give me an emotional temperature reading on that. So when she came to me, we went in the circle, and I just went like this, indicating how little support I felt from my family. And then we had the workshop where we told these stories. This group of people told their stories. And she was really, it was smart. This woman was very good. At the end, she said, I want you to go around the circle and do that again. And when it came my turn, I went like this. Because I understood that the lack of support I had from my family was not much. It was not nearly, it wasn't on a par with the abuse that I had heard about that others had suffered. People thrown out of their families, shunned, I'm never going to talk to you again. And I felt like, boy, you're really wallowing in self-pity here when you consider what these other people are doing. So I get at I mention these emotional moments because, again, they capture, I think, this mood inside the Jewish community of needing permission, that night, my partner, I then had a partner on the website, Adam Horowitz, and he drove me home. My parents' house is in the suburbs. He drove me home and he said, there was a lot of Jewish hand-wringing. Now, I loved it, but for him, he was past that period, and he understood that this Jewish hand-wringing may be a necessary thing, but there is a truly self-indulgent quality to it. When you are so concerned, with giving yourself, you can't even give voice to what is you see. You can't bear witness. You go over and you're there to bear witness. You go to an occupation, you bear witness. You're seeing apartheid. Your job is to bear witness. You can't bear witness because you're afraid of what your parents are going to say. I think that that describes my spiritual condition and a lot of people's. And one of the things that has happened to me over the years is that I would say to my mother would say, well, why are you writing these vile things on your website? And I'd say, gosh, Mom, you got to go over there. I'd like to take you, but it's apartheid. It's Jim Crow. It's just, you told me when I was a kid that I should be so proud of those Jews, and non-Jews, by the way, too, who were going south to end Jim Crow and putting their lives on the line. I really, it's no different. It's worse. I'm just doing the same. I'm involved. I'm calling it apartheid because it's apartheid. And she would go, you really have to talk to Golda about this. I really don't. And what she meant by that was she'd never been there. Her best friend moved there in 1968. And I think that one of the things that I can look back on amusement when I look at this hand-wringing period is that her friend Golda, who lives in West Jerusalem, I would go over and I would see her, and I wasn't out to her. The first couple of times there, I wasn't out to her. I was afraid of her. And I often reflected, when I began to speak, and I didn't do that many gigs like this. This is a wonderful gig, but, it's a beautiful crowd. When I started speaking, I would sometimes say to myself, well, what if Golda walked in? And I just knew that I would shut up. I would just lose my powers of speech. So it's a parable that actually reflects on the importance of women in my family life and in my moral life. The fact that I would give up my voice. So I finally came out to her a couple of years ago. I wrote her a letter. The next time I was out, I was with my wife, and we started talking about the issue, and at last my wife said, the argument became so intense, my wife said, you should not talk about this, you two. I think, which was true. We can't really talk about it. One of the last times I was there, I got a note from Golda saying, I went to your website. Is this a reflection of your unresolved conflict with your father and your failed literary ambitions? I'm glad you laughed. It was a punch in the gut to me. I had the presence of mind. I did write, Golda, this is a vicious note. But what I'm getting at is that if she came into the room, I'm out now. And so I'm sort of past that period. And in reflecting on it, I just think that there is, I reflect on the pathetic aspect of this in my own life, that I should have been so inhibited. And I think that to me, is indicative of some of the, when you consider that I'm this Harvard-educated writer who moved with this Harvard network to New York, enormously empowered as a writer, used to write articles on the cover of the New York Times Magazine, and then I had a column. I had a certain status in the mainstream world for a little while, and yet I was inhibited on this question. And I think that goes for the Jewish community. And so now I'm going to move on to the intellectual period of my remarks, and I'll wrap them up soon. The first principle that I would draw from my story is that I don't think the Jewish community can figure this out on its own. It can't. And it needs other people. It needs to be engaged with Americans who have, other Americans who have been such a party to the oppression over there. And it needs to be engaged with the people whom we have hurt, our community, our American Jewish community, is responsible for injuring, profoundly injuring. We bear some large responsibility for the rights violations of the Palestinians. So we have to be engaged with that community. There's no way out of this without engaging this other community. And there's my own kind of sort of ridiculous inhibition is reflected in a larger inhibition within the Jewish community when this issue is brought up in a Jewish space, in a solely Jewish space. And I think that the positive side of that is that this kind of hand-wringing period, I think the whole American Jewish, the organizational community is about to embark on, is going to be embarking on. They are going to have to face the Nakba as I face the Nakba. They're going to have to deal with this. I have a friend in the audience tonight who works with J Street. J Street is part of this. I have a lot of problems with J Street, but they're part of this movement inside Jewish life I hope towards some awakening on this. But it's not going to happen inside the Jewish community. That's one principle. I think that another principle that I want to emphasize, I haven't talked much about visits to Palestine. The theme that I would emphasize is that it's worse than you think. It's worse than you think. And again, Scott, my friend who came up with me, my publisher, likes to say, in arguments with his family, he's never had inhibitions about having arguments with his family. He has said to people in his family, Israel deserves all the criticisms it's getting from me and others, and more. And I feel that way so strongly because I've observed the occupation. I've observed the conditions. I've observed people who are forced out of their homes, forced off their land, humiliated. One of the recent times I was over, we were in Hebron on a street that's divided, an apartheid street, Jews on one side, in occupied Palestine, Jews on one side, Palestinians on the other. And we were with a Palestinian guide showing us the city, and a 14-year-old settler boy on his horse came up to the Palestinian and started berating him, and then summoned a man with I believe he had a semi-automatic rifle with him, summoned him to dismiss this person from his land, the territory. It's just, things happen constantly that if it were happening to Jews, my original community would be up in arms and full-throated, calling for attention. And it's happening to Palestinians. And so it is worse than you think. The thrust of this talk is not really about the occupation, but every time I go there, I just am struck more by just the horrible inequity and discrimination. Seeing a swimming pool, going into the occupied territories, and on a hot day, seeing hundreds of people at a swimming pool in a settlement, and nearby the Palestinians have water tanks on the tops of their houses because they only get water 3 times a week. I think that almost any condition that made concrete it's an enormity. And Hilda was clear about this. My community, which includes many Jews, is clear about this, that we have to bear witness to this. We have to change the American discourse on this. That's the game, is to change the American discourse. I think that recently addressing this question of Jewish fears, Rebecca Vilkomerson of Jewish Voice for Peace said to a Jewish group, a Jewish audience largely, in a synagogue, said, I understand their fears. She was, on the one hand, respecting these fears, these people, about discussing this question. But she said, how long do these other people have to wait for their rights while you're working out your fears? Now, she did not say this in an abusive manner, but to me, it speaks to monstrous selfishness. I think it's just monstrous selfishness. And I engage as a Jew on this question, and I'm very proud of the Jewish lessons that I got as a child about, I'm not trying to hurt the Jewish community, but I think that accountability and some degree of awareness about this kind of monstrous selfishness that has possessed us, or so many of us, when we're looking at this. The idea that you could, even now, that you could talk about a peace process that's produced nothing for 20 years, and what are we going to do next on the peace process when people don't have basic rights? 4 million people have no rights. They don't believe in a lot of those people don't believe in the peace process for good reason. Again, I'm going to refer to Rashid Khalidi's book. He says that the second intifada, this horrible thing that obviously scared so many Israelis and so changed the climate over there, the second intifada was in some ways inevitable because they had been told this peace process began in 1991. They said the final status by 97 and 90, your freedom will be, 99, 2000 had come. There was nothing. Who can accept that? We would not accept that. And we wouldn't accept an economic peace in the West Bank, which is what they offer now, any more than the patriots whom we celebrate in this city would accept taxation without representation. And similarly, Rashid says the rise of Hamas, an organization that I have no great sympathy for, and Islamism is not something I support. The rise of Hamas was also an inevitable, or was aided by the fact that they refused to play into this process that Palestinians understood was a sham process. And when you look at his book, when you consider that in 1977 they said, yes, we will have autonomy, we will give Palestinians autonomy in the West Bank, that doesn't mean sovereignty, that doesn't mean territory. It's precisely what's has happened to this day. Their territory has been sliced down again and again. How can these people believe in a peace process? I wouldn't. And I think that the kind of sustaining of this myth of a peace process at a time when, by people like me, or people in my community who are so empowered, is arrogant.
That was coverage of the Hilda Silverman Memorial Lecture with guest Dr. Sara Roy and with keynote speaker Philip Weiss, who gave a lecture entitled Community and Ideology: What Will It Take for American Jews to Walk Away from Zionism? Stay with us. We'll be back after this short break.
You are watching the Arabic Hour, a program of news, views, culture, cuisine, and the Arab American experience. To view today's program or any previous programs, log on to our website at www.arabichour.org.
Thank you so much for joining us. Some stations will be leaving us, and we look forward to seeing you next week. For those of you staying with us for the remainder of the hour, we hope you enjoyed the last musical segment following the closing credits. On behalf of all of the volunteers here at the Arabic Hour, this is Ghinwa Hakim, and I look forward to seeing you next week.
The Arabic Hour has been brought to you in part by the William G. Abdalah Memorial Library, a resource center for information and education on the Arab American experience, the American Arabic Benevolent Association, AABA, an umbrella association for community endeavors, the Nicholas G. Beram Veterans Association and Ladies Auxiliary, providing veteran services, scholarships with community pride, and by our members as well as contributions from viewers like you.